Hello, I'm Miriam Vale. I am the artistic director of Indie Memphis, and thank you for joining this event today. We'll be talking with Claudia Weil, the filmmaker who made Girlfriends in 1978, and Penny Allen, whose film Property in 1978 played along with Girlfriends at the U.S. Utah Film Festival, which later became Sundance. This event is part of the Sundance satellite screenings at Indie Memphis. Indie Memphis is an organization that has been around for 24 years. The mission of Indie Memphis is to support community through independent film and support the development of filmmakers. We fulfill our mission through four programs: our annual film festival, a filmmaker development program, our youth film festival, and our year-round cinema. Currently, our year-round cinema is virtual mostly and almost entirely virtual. So if you're in Memphis or outside of Memphis, you can check out some of our films and programs. You can also browse on YouTube and see some of our past talks. If you'd like to learn more or buy tickets, you can go to indiememphis.org. And now it is my great honor to speak with two American filmmaking pioneers, Claudia Weil and Penny Allen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk for the Sundance satellite screens at Indie Memphis. It is my great pleasure today to have a talk with two filmmakers who had films in what was then called the Utah U.S. Film Festival in Salt Lake City. And that film festival evolved into eventually become, by 1985, this what we now know as the Sundance Film Festival. On the original board was Robert Redford. And in that festival, it was largely retrospective of US films. And there was a small regional film festival, a small regional section of new independent films. And there was so much interest in these new independent films that that became the focus of both the festival and the Institute. And it's my great honor to have two filmmakers whose work was in that first regional section. And we have Penny Allen, whose film Property was in Sundance at the time, which was then the Utah US Film Festival. And Penny is joining us from Paris. Hello, Penny.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being
Happy
here.
to be with you. Yeah.
Thank you. And we also have Claudia Weil, whose film Girlfriends was in that first film festival. Thank you, Claudia, for being here.
My pleasure.
You've both worked in theater, and Claudia, you've worked in television. And so I'd like to talk about both of your careers, but let me first talk about how you both came to make your first feature films. Claudia, you were working in documentary before. And so how did you decide to make the switch from documentary to feature filmmaking?
I've been making, I've been making documentaries about 5 or 6 years, and the most in I don't know, it was maybe less than that. In 1973, I was invited by Shirley MacLaine to go to. She was invited to the first American women's, to bring the first American women's delegation to the People's Republic in 1973. And I had approached her because I made a film with a friend, Joyce Chopra, called Joyce at 34. And when we set about trying to get it distributed, it wasn't that easy. So with Julia Reichert and Jim Klein and Amelie Rothschild and Leanne Brandon, and I can't remember, there were maybe a couple others, Deborah, we started New Day Films, which was a feminist distribution collective. And the first thing we had to do was do a brochure for the film. So for that, we realized, oh, you need quotes. So I got access to Shirley MacLaine to see if she would watch the film and give a quote. And she gave a lovely quote, and then she said, how about coming to China with me and making a documentary about this first delegation of American women, that let's put it together. So we did that, and we had an amazing trip. And it was, we were the first delegation after Nixon. People in China hadn't seen Westerners, for the most part, since 49. So literally when we get off the bus, like in Canton, we'd be surrounded by crowds would just gather around us to stare at us because they hadn't seen people with round eyes. To be not indirect. Anyway, so, it's been a long time editing it. And over the course of editing, I realized editing a feature documentary is very tricky because you have to figure out the story or the angle. I thought I'd really like to start from a script instead of having to discover it during the process of editing. So I decided I had gotten a grant for another documentary about growing up Jewish in America from the AFI. And then I decided, let me convert this into a narrative film. And I had this idea about two young women who's, what happens to their relationship when one of them gets married. And I approached my friend Vicki Polan to write the screenplay and paid her with, part of the AFI money. And basically that was how it started. And then it grew from there. With that $10,000, we filmed about a 30-minute film. And then we realized, I was much more interested in Susan than in Anne, and wanted to follow her story and how Anne comes in and out of it, and what happens to that friendship in connection to what's happening to her life. And so Vicki and I kind of plotted out the story, and she went away and wrote it. And then, I had to stop and start to raise money. But basically, I'd stockpiled 3 grants, 10 from the AFI, 20 from the New York State Council for the Arts, and 50 from the National Endowment for the Arts. And with that 80, I shot most of the film. And with the goodwill of a lot of people and liens and loans and so forth. Friends cooking for us, lending us cars, stuff like that. And then I was able to raise about $60,000 privately, actually to film the last bit and to get into editing. So, but I never would have been able to finish the film without Irwin Young from DuArt, who, I was invited to after everybody in New York turned it down, the New York Film Festival turned it down, Don Rugoff, who was the only distributor of kind of art films, turned it down. But then Rotterdam, which was an avant-garde film festival, invited it. And I asked Irwin if he would blow it up to 35, because we had shot on 16. Because I thought that if I finished it in 16, nobody would ever think of it as a real film or as a feature. And so he very kindly did that, and that's the way it got made.
Great.
Mhm.
And Penny, I'd love to ask you the same thing. And as Claudia's answered in her question, the question is, how did you come to make this feature film, this narrative feature film property, your first feature film, but also related to Claudia's answer, how did you find the funding to be able to do that?
Well, my story is quite a different one, actually, because I was living in Portland, Oregon, and in a neighborhood that, and I was working as an organizer for the land use of that neighborhood, and because the city was constantly threatening to destroy most of it to build high rises. And at the same time, I had a theater troupe, and we were doing theater. And then the third element that came along was meeting Eric Edwards, who became the cinematographer of the film. And for a long time, we did a weekly show on the local cable that was called Urban Free Delivery. And with all those elements, at a certain point, both Eric and I decided, it would be really great to turn all of this into a feature film. And so I applied for a grant a seated grant, a comprehensive, I sort of forgot what it means now, but anyway, it was a federal government plan for putting people to work. And I got a grant as an individual artist. And then with that, I began to write the script and to collect the people. And then I applied to CETA for a large grant. And we did get a grant of about $100,000, which was a fortune at that time. And that is how the movie was financed. And at a certain point in the process, it occurred to me like, well, who owns this movie? And so I had a lawyer, write up something so that I was the owner of that movie, even though it was financed by CETA Project. And so the first thing that happened is that Bob Satan at the Northwest Film Center said, "Oh, there's this festival that's going to be happening, in Utah, and why don't you submit it?" So I did do that, and it was selected, and I think that was pretty much the first time that it was shown, and so with a couple of people, with Eric and also Michael Horowitz, who was in the film, we went to Utah to the festival. At the same time, the movie was invited to be in Telluride, which was just right before Cotton. And so we went there too, because they were very close together. And actually, when my movie came out, a lot of things were happening. Mavericks in New York, and it was chosen for that, and mine was also in Rotterdam, and actually it was in festivals, all over the world. It was a very successful festival film, and so it had a different life, and it was when you wonder like, how could a regional film? Well, I guess I never thought of it as a regional film. And you say, yes, it's a very Western story, Western film and all that. And well, I think it's a very Portland story. Portland is known for being weird, and my movie is kind of weird. So, so that is the story of how my movie came to be.
And Penny, you had your sound recordist went on to have several films in Sundance, didn't he?
Yes, we didn't have a sound recorder, until the very last moment. And Eric said, "Well, I'll call up my former roommate from the Rhode Island School of Design, where the two of them studied film." And it was Gus Van Sant. And Gus said yes, and so he was the sound recorder. And yes, so that was his first movie. It was my first movie. It was Eric's first movie, and it led to a lot of things.
That's great. And yeah, absolutely. And was it one of the first movies? We talked about regional cinema. I do think it's very Portland, but I'm from the Northern California, and I also recognize a very West Coast particular weirdness. And there's so many, I want to ask what was the filmmaking world like? You said it was all of your first films. Were there other films being made in Portland at the time?
No, there were not. It was the first film made in Portland as well. And, the first feature film. And so, I mean, it was just a crazy idea on my part, let's make a movie. And since Eric knew how to do it, and I had all this theater experience, I knew how to create something that had a beginning and a middle and an end, and would last about an hour and a half. I mean, that was easy for me. And I had all of those people that to play in the movie that had been in my theater group or others that I found in the marginal community in Portland. It just came together.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of your actors? Some of them were already very well known, and some of them went on to great careers in your film. Do you want to mention some of the performers in your film?
Mine? Are you talking to me? Okay.
Yes, Penny. Yeah, sorry.
Well, Walt Curtis was a well-known poet in the Portland area, and I guess that's who you're referring to. Actually, no one else was well known. I don't know who you're thinking of as being well known.
Walt was well known.
Walt Curtis, yeah. And he wrote. He had written a book called Malinoche, and which was successful, I think, on the West Coast. And at a certain point, I guess this is the story you're wanting me to tell. At a certain point, in the middle of shooting, Gus said, "Who is that?" And he, and she pointing to Walt Curtis, and I said, "Well, here." And I gave him the book, and so he read Malinoche, and it turned out to be his first movie.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't angling for a particular story, but that is, I did notice the Malinoche poster in your film, which is very notable, and had to kind of check the timeline of exactly what was happening. But I think the actor Corky Hubert also went on to a big career after your film.
Right, Corky Hubbard, yeah. Yes, yeah. He did, and he went to Hollywood right after making Property, and he was in a lot of movies and did have a career in Hollywood. He was. I missed him as soon as he left. He was a great collaborator of mine. He was in the last piece of theater that I made before becoming a filmmaker, and he was very important in my creative process. I think he's very important in Property. He's the one that makes it lighthearted. It's kind of a hard story. People who are too poor to afford to buy their houses, and they're going to be can't think of the word in English. Sorry, they're going to lose their houses, and without a lighthearted spirit like Corky Hubbard, it would have been not the same movie at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's such a unique presence too. His particular humor, he's everything about him. It's so interesting to me that he's the person also in the film who went on to have the most robust Hollywood career, and is so recognizable from TV and from other things. And Claudia, you had also some of the early performances by some people who went on to be very well known. You had Bob Balaban and Christopher Guest. Do you want to talk a little bit about your casting process and how, if you had you known Bob Balaban and Christopher Guest before you cast them?
No, I didn't. I didn't know either of them. I mean, I'm not sure how I set it up, but I just had like an open casting in my office. I think I called agents and sent them the screenplay, and so Bob and Chris and Melanie all just came in to read, and Chris had already done some work, but I'm not sure that I knew it. I mean, they'd all already done some work, but they had all done some interesting work, but I wasn't that hip for that much of a film watcher. So I was just looking to find my characters, and who casting is such an interesting process because you learn so much about who your characters are and who they could be in going from the page to a reading. All of a sudden, depending on who's reading it, you see the character differently, and you get new ideas, and or you change your ideas, or you don't, or you understand what was really right about the writing. So it's an amazing process. But I have to say that with all three of them, the moment they started reading, it was just clear. I mean, Chris, wasn't playing the charming young guy. He was odd and quirky and specific and kind of teasing, somewhat withholding, and yet very attracted to her. And he kind of totally got that quality and pushed it, and brought it kind of up and made it specific to himself. So it was no longer an idea, it was a person, it was a character. And I think that's what good casting is, where, your idea of a character becomes somebody when the actor kind of weds themselves to what's written. It's like a whole new thing starts. And with Balaban, it was interesting because she does something in defiance or kind of around the marriage, which is she has an abortion without telling her husband, which is a pretty radical thing to do, certainly then, even now, perhaps, right? You'd think it would be something you would communicate. And so you had to understand when you met him what that was about, and still really like the guy. And I realized what that was about is that he wanted her life. He wanted her life for him, for his life. And she wanted her life. And they were both sort of fighting for their notion of her life. And Balaban had that toughness. He's very silky and very smooth and very kind of geeky and not leading mannish, but he's incredibly tenacious. Without leading with it, not in a macho way. And Melanie just brought so much joy and kind of unapologetic kind of forward drive to this character. I don't know, it's just, it was not, once I met them, it wasn't hard to cast at all, right? I mean, I think that's always true, maybe, once you meet the right people, it's not hard. It's like, but I did read a great many people, and people still come up to me now and say, I read for Susan, or I read for, did you remember we met when I, just really peculiar because I don't remember anything. I mean, it was, a long time ago.
I want to ask, so you were in very different positions as far as regionalism. Penny's film Property was was like the first feature film in Portland, and your film, on the other hand, is made in New York City. For the
Right.
countless films, was there a different kind of New York you were interested in showing? Did you have any thoughts of did you have other New York films in your head, and was there something else you wanted to show, or did that kind of happen?
I was, I'd lived in New York or near New York all my life. So, except for college. And I wanted to show the New York I knew, which was downtown and lofts and tiny, quirky apartments and people who could only pay like $100, $200 rent but part-time jobs or low-paying jobs, or that was a world that wasn't seen on screen. On screen was a more glamorous world. And part of the impetus, I think, unconsciously, it wasn't a conscious motive, in making the film was to see, to see a film that reflected my life or the world I lived in, not this idealized life. So yeah, that is, I guess, what I wanted to show, although it wasn't a conscious, idea.
Yeah,
You
that
can
makes sense.
attribute a lot of stuff retroactively, that might not be true.
Of course. Even just in this conversation, I'm realizing how much plays in your film, the apartment, the walk up, the painting the apartment,
Yes.
making a small space is so important. And in Penny's film as well, it's these big old Victorian houses and the stained glass and the
Yes.
falling wallpaper. It's so interesting how much your sets became these places, these homes became
Absolutely.
sets. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in the case of my film, it was our settings, our locations were the ones that were the houses and the rooms and the spaces that were actually at stake in terms of the city planning. So it's like I didn't have to go very far. The movie starts in my house, as a matter of fact. The opening scene, or where Walt Curtis lives, is in my house. So you didn't have to go very far. And also didn't have to do any decoration. It was the way it was. And, so I like what Claudia is saying, that sometimes it's only retrospectively that you know how the thing came to be, or how, why it is this way rather than another way. And how much those individuals who play in the film, created the feeling of the film. And, without them, there would be no film. They are the film. My characters are the film. And I think but the whole idea of discovering it retrospectively, as people ask, how did this thing come together? And it's like, in my case, it was very helter-skelter.
Mhm.
And I think it was sort of that way also for Claudia. And, to make us say something that sounds like it was a completely pre-planned experience would be false.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because you two your films were both in the US Utah Film Festival, but Claudia, you were able to go to the European festivals that your film,
Yeah.
but you weren't able to go to the Utah one. And I think, Penny, you had the opposite experience. You were at Utah and I guess Telluride, but you weren't able to. I heard.
Oh, I went to Rotterdam. Yeah.
Oh, you did go to Rotterdam.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I think I read something in that book, Liberating Hollywood, that you weren't able to come up with funds to go to the European festival, but books get things wrong.
Well, I didn't go to all of them. I mean, the film was also in a film festival in Germany, and I didn't go. And I didn't go to the one in Portugal, and I didn't go to the one in Moscow. So no, I did not follow on it. I didn't really have the funds to do that, but it was really important to go to that first one, and also very exciting, because we drove there and drove through all of the desert, and in order to get there, and it was an exciting adventure.
Yeah, and so you didn't get a chance to meet at that festival, but you're meeting for the first time now, meeting on Zoom. So that's such a nice
I'm
pleasure.
glad too. Yeah.
And then so when you did go, Penny, did you find, I know that they had a very small selection of new films. Did you find, I think Eagle Purnell was there. Did you find a community of other filmmakers, of other independent filmmakers there?
Well, I wouldn't call it a community, no, but I did know meet Eagle Canal, the whole shooting match, wonderful film, and he and my cinematographer Eric Edwards became friends. And as a matter of fact, Eric shot his next movie, which was called Last Night at the Alamo. And so, you know, that was the way that things worked there. And I also met Jan Saunders, who was representing Girlfriends for Claudia, and that was an important friendship. And also we met, you know, George Romero was there with Martin, and so I met him, and you know, he was really interesting. Also, I met Mark Rappaport there, and Mark and I became friends, and that was a friendship that lasted a long time. So, but
Is Mark Rappaport still around?
he lives in Paris too.
He does?
Yes, yes, yes.
Will you say hello for me?
Okay, I will, yes.
Or send me his email. That would be great.
Okay, yeah. Right. You could have had him in this panel. Because he was one of the first filmmakers in, you know, in the Sundance thing. So anyway, so I you know, I guess I would say that was the way it was. I wouldn't call it a community or anything, because I personally had never, you know, had no experience in the film festival at that point. And you know, there were a lot of people there, and there were a lot of people there from Hollywood, and there was, you know, it was already as chaotic as most film festivals are. And you know, so, and I, you know, so I didn't really make my way or anything at that first one.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the other filmmakers. It's really an incredible roster of filmmakers. But I think both of your two films were the ones that were the prize winners. This was a competition. And I think Claudia's film won Best Film. And Penny, your film also won a jury award. Is that right?
Well, I guess so. I mean, and I think Eagle Canal's film was the second, you know, won second place, not mine. But but actually, now it's stuff I don't remember. You know, I don't remember. I do remember this huge, you know, banquet, I guess we call it, at the end. I can't remember if we'd already if it was before or after the prizes were announced, but each one of us spoke, and so what I said was that we were representing the multiplicity of filmmaking possibilities, unlike Hollywood, which is much more uniform. And it was interesting because somebody came on, you know, right after that, I think it was her name, Catherine Ross, and she sort of put me down for having said that. But anyway, it's what I felt. I felt like we were the multiplicity.
That's so interesting, because that leads me to my next questions is so you made sure to hold on to the ownership of your film, Penny, which you still have the ownership of,
Yes.
and which is why we'll be able to show it at the Indie Memphis Virtual Cinema, and you can watch it if you're watching this now. It should be in release there if you're watching it when it first comes out. And Claudia, you took a different route. After your film got into Cannes, you went to LA and sold your film to Warner Brothers. And can you both tell me about how I'll start with you, Claudia. So after the festival run, how was the distribution of your film? How did you feel? Did it get out did you feel happy with the way it got out, especially after making, you know, smaller documentaries, being a self-distributor with New Day Films? How was the experience of big studio distribution for you?
Well, you know, studios were not set up to distribute small independent films at that time. I'm not sure, you know, they're better equipped now, but nevertheless, they were very solicitous of it. They opened it in 12 cities in like 1 or 2 theaters in each city, you know, whereas the norm for Warner Brothers was 2,000 to 4,000 prints, and saturated many theaters and cities all over the country, to do what's limited and then to go wide. So they really kind of nurtured it, and waited for kind of reviews and interviews and all kinds of press to take it a little wider. They never tried, to push it super wide, because I don't know. I think considering they did a pretty good job. I mean, people didn't really know how to release independence, but they did nurture it. And they certainly got a huge amount of press and great press. And part of that had to do with simply the oddity of my being a woman director, and I mean, myself and Elaine May, like 2 years later, were the third and fourth women admitted to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences as directors. We were the third and fourth after Ida Lupino and Dorothy Arzner. So, I mean, not that the Academy is necessarily a reflection of the population, but it was still a pretty exotic thing to find a woman director at that time. I'm sure Penny would say the same thing.
Right. Well, my film was part of the independent feature project, so that it did
Right.
circulate a bit with that, and also there was, I've sort of forgotten what the name of it was, but now that went around the United States and played in various art houses, and it's kind of interesting because after I made Property, when it first came out, I remember saying to the first screening in Portland, I said, this movie is going to last a long time. It's going to, and it has, it has never ceased being booked. And in all of these years, 40 years of bookings, there's been no really long lapse. And, I mean, last year it was played in Spain. And I must say, it's quite exciting. The film is, since I live in France, the film is going to open in France as a classic, and here it's called the Patrimoine, but it's going to be a classic film, and it's going to be very exciting. It was supposed to open on November 11th, but suddenly we were all locked down. So of course that didn't happen. And now it's supposed to happen in April. And hopefully we won't be locked down again because I think it'll be a wonderful experience. And in the country that I live in, which is really gratifying.
That's fantastic. That's really great. A real race in Paris.
And yeah, but it's going to play all over France. There are 150 art houses in France, which is like shocking to people who live in the United States. But so there's a lot of potential there for where it can play.
That's great.
We'll see. I'll let you know how it works.
Yeah, let me know. So there's a specific art house circuit, or who's the distributor?
The distributor is called Splendor, and they're doing right by me right now. I mean, we'll see how it unfolds, but I'm very pleased with the way it's working right now.
That's fantastic. That's great.
And I feel that I was right when I said all those years ago, this film is going to last a long time. And I'm not exactly sure why I thought that at the time, or am I sure why it's happening? But I think a lot of it has to do with some of it has to do with the fact that it's about sorry, lost the word in English again. But anyway, it's about gentrification. That's what that's the word. It's about gentrification in a,
Right.
in a, you know, and I think that it's timely that way. I think that's one of the reasons why it keeps going, because there's gentrification around the world. That was certainly the big issue in Spain last year when they played Spain.
What I love about the way you tackle it, though, Penny, is that it also tackles. I live very briefly in Portland, and it's you know, in general, Oregon tends to be a very white state, but your film deals with race and gentrification in Portland, which is still underreported. I think in like the history of African American neighborhoods and gentrification of those, and so that I think
that was so important. And the neighborhood that I have talked about here was also one of the 2 or 3 African American Black neighborhoods in Portland, and traditionally, and so that's in the movie. You know that and there is you know, in the group that are there together, there is one Black person, and it's not really clear at the end of the movie, is he going to stay in the group or is he not going to stay in? And I wanted it to be ambiguous in that way, you know, like because he would end up being the only Black person. So that's something that he would want. Interestingly, that real neighborhood in Portland is still mixed. There are more Black people living there now than there were when I lived there.
Wow, that's amazing.
Well, there's a different class of people, you know, and I suppose you would say, because the neighborhood has been gentrified, you know, a Victorian neighborhood, instead of being crumbling, falling apart houses. Imagine how nice they are now.
Yeah. I want to ask briefly about, so we talked about your first films and then your follow-ups. Penny, you made a film called Pay Dirt, and I believe this was supposed to be part of a trilogy of land use. Is that correct? And then
right. But it's land use in the you know, a deep way. I mean, it's not, because it never come out and say it. But Pay Dirt, it was much more my rural land use movie, and it's about people who are trying to who are financing their vineyard by cultivating marijuana, and so they have these 2 crops, one that is already financially worthwhile, and the other one isn't, because it takes a long time before you get a crop out of my little grapevines that you're planting. So that one was also a feature. It was my second feature, and it was also in Sundance in 81. I think it was, yeah.
Were you ever tempted? You also made that film independently. Were you ever tempted to try to seek funding in Hollywood? I mean, you said what your opening statement was at the Sundance Utah dinner. So I'm guessing that you were just sort of averse to the whole idea. But were you ever tempted to try to make a third film or in Hollywood, or what was that? What did you?
Well,
how did you feel about
that? I did meet somebody when I was there for Pay Dirt, who said, "Do you have an idea for another movie?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "Well, you haven't talked to me about it." And so I did go to Hollywood and meet with this man, and it was an interesting thing, and I wasn't really drawn into it, though. It didn't seem right to me. And then not too long after that, really not too long after that. Oh dear. Sorry, I hope that isn't ruining everything. Telephone. Anyway, should I keep talking, or is it?
I think it's charming. Go ahead. If it'll stop, I think go ahead.
Yeah. Not too long after that, after doing Pay Dirt, I met somebody who became my husband and my lover and my husband, and we went to live on a horse ranch in Eastern Oregon. So I stopped making movies for a long time because my life was just different. I became an environmentalist out there in Eastern Oregon, and my life was environment for a long time. Until I moved to Paris, actually. I moved to Paris directly from that ranch, which was a shock, I say, to go from that one vast kind of environment to a tiny apartment in Paris. But anyway, so I continued making my films in France.
Which I imagine is very different and a different culture, as you're talking about, with the distribution and with the robust art houses. But Claudia, I want to ask, you made your second film, It's My Turn, delightful film. You made that at Columbia. So the first film you made yourself, you financed yourself, made it over 4 years, sold it to Warner's, and then the second film was made with the studio. How was that experience for you compared to the first one?
It was a very different experience, obviously, not. I mean, the first one was really anxiety provoking because there was no money and never knew what we could pull off and so forth. And the second one was anxiety provoking because there were so much politics that I really didn't understand how to navigate. It wasn't just about making the film, it was about making kind of political things, making people kind of, if people gave you notes, kind of trying to agree with them in a certain way while really doing what you wanted, and I would just say, no, I don't think that works, and you have to be kind of less direct and more subtle, and I really had not a clue about that.
Wow.
It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that I foresaw that when I was
in
Hollywood. And
I get it. That's smart. I was smart that you foresaw it. I really didn't. I didn't think about it. And so, it wasn't, it was so much that you had to do in addition to making the film, just to keep it on track and to keep, that was very hard. I really didn't want to do that again.
Yeah, I imagine, I always hear from filmmaker friends that still the specific skill that sort of, giving the studio what they want, but still doing what you want to do. But as you just said, you were the fourth woman director in the, do you think there was also just the,
it's enormous
misogyny,
enormous misogyny.
Yeah.
I mean, I was working for, the film was produced by Ray Stark, who's well known to be a monster. And, he would come on the set in the morning and sort of boom out in front of the, 100 or so, mostly male middle-aged crew. So, Claudia, you wearing a bra today? I mean, how do you get people to respect you or treat you, it was just like, if your producer is treating you like a sex object or a toy.
That's awful.
It just was not conducive.
I'm sorry for
in a
you.
movie. That was not fun. That was really not fun. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then afterwards, you both, you went back to Penny to filmmaking, but quite a while. There was a long gap, right, between Pay Dirt, and then you didn't make films again until was there about a 20-year gap or so?
About a 20-year gap, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And you went back to theater in that time, is that correct? Or
no.
Oh, no, not at all.
I worked for the Minister of Environment, and I was definitely involved in environmental issues and until 9/11, which was 2001. And it was really interesting how rapidly the subject of environment lost, lost all of its power. And the only subject that was happening, in the zeitgeist was security. And so it's hard for people to believe this now, because now the environment is important again. But it just was, disregarded. And there was nothing was happening. Everything closed down. And so for a while, I was a translator. I translated books, and from French to English. And then, kind of completely, I wasn't even seeking to become part of the filmmaking scene, but something happened to me. It fell into my hands, in my lap, which was that I was on a plane going from Paris to Portland. And this guy got on the plane and sat down next to me and looked at me and said, "You're an American, aren't you?" And he started talking, and he talked for whatever, it's like 16 hours, because that's how long it takes to get from Paris to Portland. And wow. He had just come from Iraq. His best friend had just been blown up the day before. And he wanted to tell an American everything that he had to say about Iraq, about being a soldier in Iraq. He was just on leave, for 2 weeks. So he was completely riveting, to say the least. And, I didn't even think at the time about that I was going to be making a film about him, because I don't go around with a camera. And, he had a computer with him, and he showed me all these horrible photographs. And, as a matter of fact, I couldn't even look at them. It was so awful. And he said, "Okay, well," later he said, "Okay, I'm going to send you a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to send you lots of photographs and lots of videos, and I want you to show them to everybody, because I want everybody to know that war is hell." And he did send them to me, not immediately, actually about five months later, and when I got them, I was glad to get them. I was glad that he kept his word. And, so something began forming in my mind and all that, but I really was seeking another producer to do something and not make that shift, not go back to filmmaking. But no one wanted to do it. So I said, well, I have to do this myself. So I did it myself. I made the movie myself. And so that's how I got back into it. The movie had a lot of success and won a lot of prizes and was shown a lot of places. So, so it was worth it. I have to say that I'm still in touch with this guy. I haven't abandoned him for a long time after our encounter, because I did finally, go. I went to where he. I met with him halfway between where he lived and Portland. I went back into Portland and we shot a lot of footage of him there. But I knew that it was terribly important, since I was the person he had told everything to. I knew that he would need to keep telling me about it for a long time. And so I did make myself available, and it was true. He really did need it. And then he gradually didn't, really gradually. And so when I talk to him now, it's, a lapse of 6 months or something like that. And we don't have that same bond anymore, which is great. And I mean, he's not in Iraq, he's in Washington State. And he has a real life, he recovered.
So when both of your films premiered at Sundance, there were, and then, or what became Sundance, and then in the years afterwards, there was a robust representation of women filmmakers, which abated for a while, and then in recent years has come back, those numbers. Now, in the last few years at Sundance, there have been really fairly equal representation of women and men filmmakers, and really some really interesting, very independent filmmaking. Does it seem to you this is are you encouraged by, does it seem like now is an easier place for women filmmakers than when your films came out in 1978?
I wouldn't know.
Neither would
I
I.
don't think I don't think Claudia would know either. You know, it's as I said, it's an angle that we're not sitting in that place to have that information.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at it from the outside, just like you are.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry not to be more helpful. It appears to be, but we don't have firsthand knowledge. And that's the only thing that's valuable. Otherwise, we're just echoing newspaper articles right now.
Right.
That's totally fair. That's totally fair. Well, I appreciate so much your firsthand knowledge of this of your experiences of your first films, and I'm so glad you both had a chance to meet, since you didn't meet when both your films were prize winners.
Great.
1978.
Thank you for bringing us together. It's great.
Yeah,
And,
I'm so glad.
and what you're doing with Memphis is really interesting. Sounds like you're getting some really great stuff happening. Congratulations. They're lucky to have you.
Oh, thank you. It means a lot, especially coming from you, Claudia.
No, you're one of the really good ones. Writers, curators.
Right. You're a great curator. Yeah.
Yeah, you're a really good curator, and very creative and interesting work. So I appreciate your wanting to put us in touch, and you're talking to us.
Oh, thank you. Well, don't make me tear up, but thank you both so much for joining me, and thank you for the work you do. And
thank you. And send us a link to everything that's happening with your indie. Okay.
Will do. Thanks again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.